And done. Yeah, I think I can do that. So what is state in React? Well, React State is a way for React to keep track of specific values that you specify, and then you can utilize those values inside of your React code. You can also update those values, and React will automatically update those values for you whenever you specify to, and it will re-render that component automatically whenever you do update a value. So let's go ahead and see how we can import the useState hook, and let's see how we can utilize state. So to start off, I've got a basic counter component here, which just has a 0 hard-coded at the moment, and then I've got a button that we can later utilize that will allow us to update that counter component. But first, we need to import the React useState hook. So to do that, we're just going to go up to the top here, and we're going to say import, and we're going to pull out the useState hook from the React package. And we can utilize the useState hook to keep track of our different states. So what exactly does the useState hook do? Well, it actually does quite a few different things. The first thing that we can do with it is we can actually pass in an initial value to it. So let's see how that works. So we could say useState, and then we can pass in our initial value here. And let's say that that initial value is going to be 0, because we want, whenever this page loads, to make sure that this value here is set to 0. If we had it set to anything else, that would be fine, but that value, that initial value, is going to be output whenever the page first loads. Now, another thing that the useState hook does is it actually returns 2 values. Specifically, these 2 values are returned inside of an array. So it's actually very common practice to see a useState hook defined like this. So we could say const, and then we can actually destructure those 2 values out of that returned array into their own unique variables. So the first variable that is returned is the state itself, and we can name this whatever we want. I'm just going to name this counter val. And then the second value that is returned from this useState hook call is actually a state updating function. And again, we can name this whatever we want. I'm just going to go ahead and name this update counter. And this is how you would generally see a React useState hook being defined. But now that we've got these 2 values pulled out of this returned array, now we can actually utilize them. And the first way that we can actually utilize them is we can use this counter val variable inside of our JSX code. So we could remove that 0 and we could replace it with that counter val variable. Now, if we save this, you're going to notice that nothing's changed over here. And that's specifically because we set this initial value to 0. So whenever this page initially loads, that value is initially set to the value that we passed in here, and then it is output to the screen as that value. Now, if we change this value to 25, we could see that it automatically updates to 25 whenever the page initially loads. Now, to utilize this second value that was returned, this state updating function, we first need to figure out what exactly we want to happen. So whenever we click on this button, I want this value here to increment by 1. So click, I go to 26, click, I go to 27, and so on and so forth. So the best way to do this, and the easiest way to do this, is to use an on-click listener on this button here. And then we can point to our own function. So we could say handle click, and then we can go up here and we can define that handle click function. So we could say function handle click, and we could define this as a regular function, or we could define this as an arrow function. It really doesn't matter. But I'm just going to stick with a standard function here. Then whenever we click on that button, what do we want to happen? Well, we want to update that current state value by 1. So we could say const new val is equal to the counter val, the current state variable, and then we could just add 1 to it. So then we can utilize that update counter function, and we could pass in that new value. So every time we click on this button now, it should update that value. So the way that this is working is whenever we initially render this component, this value here that is stored as the initial value that we passed in here is then going to be rendered to the screen. Now, whenever we click on this button, this function here is going to run up here, and it's going to create a new value from the current value that is stored in the counter val variable, and it's going to add 1 to it. Now we're going to call the updating function, the state updating function, and we're going to pass in our new value. And this is going to schedule an update for this value. And then it's also going to trigger a re-render. And what this does is whenever you call a state updating function, it's going to automatically trigger a re-render. So it's going to update this value, then it's going to re-render everything inside of this component, and it's going to render this new updated state variable. Now I just said that whenever you call a state updating function, it's going to schedule an update. But what does it mean to schedule an update? Well, React is not going to immediately update that value. It's going to schedule it, and then right before it re-renders the page, it's then going to update that value. And the reason that React is doing this is because many of times you have a bunch of different state updates that you need to make, all basically in the same function call. And to speed it up and make it a little bit quicker, what React does is it schedules these updates so that it happens all at once rather than one individually after another. This makes it a lot faster and a lot easier to update all of the values all at once rather than doing them individually. And we'll talk about here shortly why that's important. Now, if you've ever used React, you'll know that the point of using React is to create these reusable components that we can reuse multiple different times wherever we want inside of our application. But whenever we create these reusable components, sometimes we have 2 components or more components that need access to the exact same React state. What do we do in this situation? Well, in this situation, we need to find the closest common ancestor that these both share. So these are both being defined inside of this app function here. So this is going to be our closest common ancestor, and we're going to define our state inside of here rather than inside of either of these 2 components that are being rendered in here, because both of these components need to have access to that state. So we'll go ahead and define the state inside of here, and then we can pass those values in as props. So we're basically going to do the exact same thing that we did before. So we're going to create a function, and we're going to say handle click, and we're going to create a new constant called new val. We'll set that equal to the counter val plus 1. And then we're going to update the counter passing in the new val. Now, to pass these in as a prop, we're going to go down to each one of these and pass in the respective ones that we need access to inside of each one. So in the counter, we need access to the variable here. So we can say val, and I'm going to change the name to val so you can more easily see this. And we're going to point to the counter val variable. Now inside, let's go ahead and save that. Now inside of here, we need to accept props. So we're doing that right here. And then we can output here, we can output props.val. And despite what my VS Code editor wants to say, this does actually work. So you can actually see over here, we're getting that 0 still output to the screen here. Now for the button, we just need to create an update prop. And we're going to set that equal to the handle click function here. So we're going to point to handle click. And if we head over here, we can add an on click listener. And on the click, we're going to access props.update. So if we save that, now we should get that value updating, and it works just the same as before. So the way that it's actually working is we're passing these values in. This is going to be the name of the value on the other component. So val is going to be accessed here via props.val, and update is going to be accessed here via props.update. And this is how you can pass in state variables to some of your components. Now, another way that we can actually access them on the components themselves is actually by destructuring the props object, because the props object is actually just an object that is passed into each function call. So if we just wanted to access one individual item, just like this update function here, we can actually just remove this props dot, and we could just access the update just by grabbing the update inside of the parameters list up here. So we're going to destructure the props and just pull out that update value. Now, if we save this and we click on this here, it's still working perfectly fine. And we can do the exact same thing over here inside of the counter as well. So we can just say we want to access the val from that props that was passed in, and then we can just remove this props dot, and if we save that, it's still going to work exactly the same. Now let's run it back a little bit and talk a little bit more about state scheduling. As I said before, this is mainly a performance thing, and React does this because if you have 10, 20, 30 state values that you're trying to update all at the exact same time, you don't want that to be re-rendering every single time you make a call to a state update. So this is nice for performance, but it can cause issues and be a little confusing if you don't know how it works. So let's go ahead and take a look at how this works. So I've got the state that's being updated here. I'm calling the state update function here, and let's just console.log that counter val after we update the state. So you would think that once we call this, the value of this value right here is going to be the new value. But let's save that and actually take a look at the log here. So let's go ahead and click on the button. You can see that it updates on the screen to 1, but the log that we logged after we updated it is still the old value. Now there is a way around it, and this is exactly why I'm bringing it up right now. So if you have a state update that relies on a previous update that didn't happen after a re-render cycle. So if I have a situation like this where I am updating the state value, then I need to update the state value again for whatever reason, I can call this update counter, but I don't want to just pass in the value. Instead, I want to pass in a callback function to this. And I want to accept in that callback function the previous state. And this can be named whatever you want. I'm just going to call it previous state. Now, whenever you pass in a callback function like this, React guarantees that this value right here is the most updated state. So the way that we can update this is we can just return the new state. So we could say previous state +1. Now the way that this is going to work is we should see that this is going to update, and then this is going to pass in the most current state, which is the 1 that we're expecting it to. And then this is going to add another one on top of that. So in general, this is going to actually update twice. It's going to update this one, and then it's going to pass that new value in here, and then it's going to update that new value to 2. So let's go ahead and save that, and let's refresh our page. And let's update our counter. And now you can actually see that we're updating twice. Once for the first update here, and once for this second update here. And this is generally used whenever your current state that you need to update relies on a previous state, so this state right here, that has not yet been updated. And to be clear, yes, you can always use just this one right here as your state updating function. So if we save that, that's still going to work perfectly fine. It's just going to update 1 now, and it's going to work exactly the same, but generally you're going to see most of the time you're going to see this being used, because it's not super common that you actually need to rely on the previous state for a new state update. Now that we have a good understanding of how React State works, let's talk about how we can utilize different types of data, starting with a string. So the way that this is set up, I've just got a form here with a name input and a submit button. So whenever I type in a value into this field here and I submit the form, it's going to be output to this form value output right here. Now the way that I've got it set up over here is I've got, of course, the basic definition of useState with the value here and then the set value function here. And then I'm calling useState with an empty string as the default value. Now, I've got a form over here that just whenever I submit, is going to call this function right here, the handle submit function. It's going to pass the event in, it's going to prevent the default, and then it's going to set the form value. So it's going to call the set form value function, and it's going to pass in basically just the value of this box right here. And I'm utilizing this form value variable down here right beside the form value output, and this is going to be updated whenever this updates. So by default it's set to an empty string, and then whenever I submit and I update that, it's going to be updated to whatever value was inside of this box right here. Now one thing that may seem clear but is a little hazy whenever you actually start looking at it is updating state for objects and arrays. And you would think that you could update just a single value and then push that new value or add that new value or overwrite that new value onto the object or the array that is the current state, but that's actually not the case. With both of these and with everything with state, you actually want to just completely replace the old one. So here I've got a form value and I'm setting the initial value with a name of Tim and an age of 15. And I don't care about the age. I'm not touching the age at all. So I just want to update the name here. So you see we've got Tim being output over here on the screen. Now whenever the form is submitted, just like last time, it grabs the value from this box here and adds it to the screen here. The only difference is it's an object. Now we don't want to actually just add that value onto that old object here. We actually want to completely replace that entire object whenever we update that state. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating a new object, and then I'm spreading in all the values from the old object, and then I am updating that new name value right here, and then I'm pushing that entire new object to state. So this whole object is going to be the new object that is added as the state. And so whenever I update this, I hit submit, it's going to completely replace that entire old object with this entire new object. And this is just something you should do for everything in state. You should never try to update the old value, just try to completely replace it instead. And that is it for React State. Now I hope this helped you to understand state a little bit easier. If you did like the video, make sure you slap a like on it. If you want to get into full stack web development, I have a course that I'm continuously updating. Link is right next to me if you want to go and check it out. Otherwise, make sure you subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.